Hey, it's Guyby from Vital MX. Welcome to the 12th episode of The Inside Line, presented by Thor. This week's guest is Broc Glover. Broc grabbed 6 national championships, 3 on 125s and 3 on 500s, and won 45 races during his career from the late 70s to mid-80s. He also took the 79 125 USGP at Mid-Ohio and the 1981 Trans-USA title. He was also part of a pair of Team USA wins in the motocross and trophy designations in 1984 and 1985. Heck, he even took a crack at a GP season late in his career. That's only the half of it. He's also spent a considerable amount of time in the industry in his post-racing days, working with companies like PJ1 and his longtime employer, Dunlop. Before we get started, we've got to thank a couple of brands that help support the show. As we mentioned before, the Inside Line is presented by Thor. Since 1968, Thor MX has been supporting some of the world's most elite racers, including the 2018 250 Pro motocross champion, Aaron Plessinger. Head to ThorMX.com to see the racewear that Aaron and the rest of the Star Racing Yamaha team trust day in and day out. We also have to thank Chaparral Motorsports, who has been helping riders outfit their dirt bikes with parts, accessories, and tires for more than 30 years. Today, Chapmoto offers professional advice online and in-store, helping you to find the best riding gear and equipment for all your power sports vehicles. Visit chapmoto.com today. That's chapmoto.com. All right, that's enough housekeeping. Let's dig into this one. All right, Broc, riders of a certain era obviously know that you raced back in the day, but some of the current generation may not as much. How about a quick background on your racing and how you got started?
Well, I mean, I first started racing. I was just a recreational rider as a family. You know, we went to the desert, and I was lucky enough to live and grow up in the eastern side of San Diego County, and was able to really ride right out of our house and after school. So come home from school and jump on my dirt bike and head alongside maybe a 2-lane road for a half a mile or a mile and be out in some great trails. And so I did that a lot. And it was also fortunate enough for me too. I grew up where it was an area in El Cajon, California, which is a suburb of San Diego, but it's that's what Rick Johnson, Ron Lachine, guys like Scott Burnworth, these guys all came from that area. I think we were all exposed to the sport of motocross early. Husqvarna, when the motorcycles first came over here in the 60s, were based out of San Diego. The Torsten Hallman, which now is the Thor brand, they came here, and they were based in a suburb just next door to El Cajon called La Mesa. So the people in San Diego in general got exposed to motocross early. So myself as a young child, I remember going in and seeing some of the great Europeans, the Roger DeCosters and the Joel Roberts and people like that racing in local San Diego and Southern California locations. Back when before I ever, I maybe had ridden a mini bike, but this was, when I was 8 or 9 years old. So for me, it was fortunate, and it was, one thing led to another. I really didn't start racing full time until I raced a couple of times when I was 13, but the first time I did it, I snuck. And my parents were unfortunately going through a divorce at that time, and my mom found out about it, and I lived with my mom, and she found out that I snuck and went racing. And I got grounded for quite a few months, and motorcycle was pulled off the activity list. And so finally, after I bugged her enough to let me race a few more times, I got going at it, but didn't have the financial backing. So, from there I was able to, do okay on an old Kawasaki 100 cc bike that was
the green streak.
Yeah, it was a green streak with a 21-inch tire and a knobby on it, and it had a low pipe on it, which was funny because it came with an up pipe, and I put a low pipe on it for motocross. But
it's easier to smash that way.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I wasn't fast enough to smash it, but I got lucky enough to win a few races here and there, and pretty soon after you do that, it's the 100 cc class was always considered a entry-level class, and once I pointed out, they made me move out of the 100cc class, and I was kind of stuck because about that time the Honda Elsinore had come, and revolutionary bike, and it changed the sport completely, really, especially the 125 class, and I was having to race against these guys on a 100cc green streak, so it taught me to be a good rider, I guess. That was kind of a fun thing about it, a local guy helped me out for a good year and a half, and then my my dad and I were talking, and my brother convinced him to come watch me race, and he thought I certainly had a chance to be something at it, because my oldest brother had raced motocross for a while before I ever started racing, so my dad had been to many motocross races and knew a lot about it. And so he just kind of said if I was really serious about doing it, he probably, one of the great things he said to me, and I still remember it to this day, was that he would match me hour for hour. He felt like with my brother, maybe he worked a lot harder at it than my brother did. And especially, at those times, my brother was, he's a high school age kid, high school parties and girls and things were pretty interesting back then too. And motocross really didn't, nobody was really making a big living at it back then. So, but my dad wanted to make sure I wanted it, and I think parents and people have all seen kids that have, had, a lot handed to them, and sometimes you wonder how bad they want it or their parents want it worse. And so my dad was very wise in the fact that he wanted to make sure I wanted it, and that was really what would drive me. And so I certainly had the desire, and he was able to, help me and give me the support that got me to the nationals, and we rode the first year as 1976 as a privateer rider. And so in 1976, we did the nationals together as a father-son team with the backing of a DG Performance Company. And
I remember some DG stuff back in the day.
Yeah, it was. Trust me, the first time I missed the first race that year because I wasn't. I missed the first race that year because I wasn't 16 at the time, and it was Hangtown. And then the next race I was old enough to ride, and that was my first national. Was in Redbud. So.
You didn't fake an ID?
No, I think they would have probably caught me back then. I didn't even think about it, to be honest with you. That always seems to, I did grow up in the same area as Marty Tripes, and everybody kind of knew the Marty Tripes story where he won the first pro race at the LA Coliseum, the first Supercross, really, the modern Supercross in the LA Coliseum, and supposedly he wasn't even of age. Right. And so, we all knew that story because Marty was the local rider, and I also, the other Marty Smith, grew up in that area. So I was pretty fortunate to grow up in San Diego. So, and after my rookie year with DG, about halfway through, the Yamaha guys were really coming up and approaching me a lot. And, being a big fan of Marty Smith and the Team Honda and growing up racing a Honda Elsinore, I actually really had my heart set on trying to hopefully get signed with Team Honda, but they didn't want anything to do with me. So Yamaha seemed to be very eager and very interested in me. So I felt it was a good move for me to go over to Yamaha, and that's what I did.
Yeah, back then you could get a lot of visibility just racing CMC races in Carlsbad and Saddleback, and the factories were right there, and kind of there was a little more focus in that area.
Yeah, no question. I mean, there was a time, it's pretty undeniable, but, most of the best motocross racers were coming from Southern California. And maybe it was the weather, maybe it was the fact that you could race 12 months of the year, or it was the fact that many of us raced 2 or 3 times a week. We would literally race a night race during the week, and some guys would ride 2 or 3 night races. There was Wednesday nights, there were Friday night races, there were races all over Southern California that you could drive to. And, there were races on Saturday that were kind of the training races. They would run 40-minute motos at Saddleback or sometimes at Carlsbad. And for me, and then we always, my dad and I, especially my dad, when he got involved, we were always talking about, the one-trick pony guys. There were a lot of guys that were really good at CMC at Carlsbad or Saddleback, but when they'd get out on the nationals, they wouldn't perform nearly as well. And we couldn't, you're not sure why that was. Maybe the tracks were different or what. But my dad was always really wise in the fact that we used to chase competition, and yeah, believe me, I had my ego bruised a few times going up to a place like Indian Dunes or, and running into a local hotshot guy who he was a specialist at that track. I mean, he was the one trick pony I'm talking about. When you take him out of Indian Dunes, he wasn't particularly good, but if you could beat the best guy at Indian Dunes, if you could run with the top guys at Saddleback, and again at Carlsbad and all the other tracks that you could go to, you probably had a pretty good chance of going around the nationals. I mean, we drove all the way up to Santa Maria one time to run at a place called Spillway Park, which was a notorious sand track in the river bottom. And I got, believe me, I didn't run away with that one either. But I learned to ride the sand a little bit. So it was always, it was something we always thought it was important to kind of be able to be well versed and be able to ride. And I think it helped me adapt to the nationals probably a little better than most 16-year-old kids.
Mm-hmm. Who were some of your teammates back in DG back in the day?
That's a good question. My dad and I really just kind of did most everything on the bike at our house, and I would come over after school and go to my dad's house, and he only lived a few miles from where I did with my mom, and we just did a lot of stuff out of the garage. We would drive up to DG once in a while to pick up some parts and things, and but back then, support, you call it, my deal, they would give me a new rear tire every other race, so I would turn it around and run the sharp edge, and it wasn't like they just, you got dumped with free parts all the time, and obviously they weren't a Honda shop at the time, so buying the parts, we'd get a discount on the Honda parts. So my bikes, they had a neat, my national bike ended up having a Profab, a special frame on it, and we had a few pretty neat looking items on it. That was more just kind of a bolt together pieces that the DG sold, so it was a good way to showcase what they sold. And but the engine really wasn't much. I ran a 1975 Elsinore engine that came out of my bike that we started racing on, and it really wasn't very modified, but it was solid and didn't break down, and it was a good bike. But as for the question about the teammates, and there were many people that would run the DG jersey. I don't really, honestly, truly don't know what kind of support they got, if it was just some discounts on some of the DG parts or free DG parts, and I really don't know. But when I went on the nationals, the first national was a guy named Mark Tyre, and Mark was a great local Southern California rider, and really he was a good guy. I loved, he was nice, and it was kind of just a great guy to travel with, and a lot of fun guy. And he went, and Mark's mechanic was Pat Alexander, who ended up, becoming, still works at Suzuki to this day. Mm-hmm. And my dad worked on my bike, and then halfway through the season, Mark just decided that, he really wasn't interested in traveling on the road, and he was, he just didn't, his heart wasn't in it really. He'd done it for 2 or 3 years, and he really didn't like it so much being on the road. So David Taylor became my teammate that year, towards the end of that year. And then, I signed a mid-year contract actually with Yamaha. So as soon as the Nationals were over in August, I signed a contract for a 4-month tryout contract with Yamaha in September. So the goal was to ride the Trans Am or Trans USA Support Class Series, but I could not get an entry to see. I couldn't get an entry. They wouldn't accept me an entry in any of them, because they looked at the points based off the preceding year, and I was a rookie and I had no points, so I had no status. I was a novice expert or a novice pro, and they really were only accepting expert level pros. And so even though I'd literally won a national moto, I had finished second overall a couple of times during the nationals and ended up finishing 5th overall after even missing the first round. I couldn't get an entry. So
well, I'm sure you had a huge signing bonus and big salary on that
millions,
contract.
Yeah, it was all up front. Yeah, it was actually funny. To be honest with you, I was, at the time, I was probably the highest paid rookie that did start. I remember talking to some, quote, advisory people, that one of them was a guy that worked at DG, and I tried to ask him for some advice, because, at the time, guys like Bob Hanna had come through the DG program and went over, and I kind of knew what a guy like Steve Wise and Warren Reed, these guys were the Honda's Factory 125 riders, and I kind of knew what they were getting paid, and I just thought it was awfully low. When you're talking about paying somebody $400 or $600 a month, it was their actual salary, and you have to put it back in the mid-'70s era, where you realize that money was worth a little more than it is today.
Adjust for inflation and all.
Yeah, but you could buy a house for $30,000 and a car for $7,000 or $6,000, or I think my first pickup I paid $4,000 for. So, but the point is, I remember asking. I think I got $1,000. I asked for $1,000. And I ended up I think I asked for $1,200 a month, which I literally was told that you're out of your mind. Don't even think about asking for that. And I ended up getting it, and also I ended up getting paid another $200 a month for Yamaha's oil, which was Yamalube, to run their patch too. So I felt I was fat on the hog, making $1,400 a month, and I was probably making 2 or 3 times more than the average rookie. So I was happy with the deal I had the first year.
You rode for Yamaha throughout the pro career. Mm-hmm. You talked about how you got hooked up with them. You guys also had some interesting characters, and how was that 125 also?
Yeah, I mean, We certainly have. I mean, I was definitely hired as a support rider, and Bob Handed won the championship. He had that revolutionary water-cooled bike. Some of the older people that might be listening to this remember when they had the claiming rule, and there was a big worrisome time where a privateer actually had claimed a factory Honda motorcycle, and everybody was so worried about getting bikes claimed and things. And there was one time during that national race season in 1976 when I was a rookie. It was at believe it or not, I think it was one of the first races the Coombs family promoted at Kaiser's Ridge, and ironically it was on July 4th, 1976, which was our country's bicentennial. And that race, Yamaha had taken the water cool kit off of Bob's bike and just put a year before motor in it because they were worried about it getting
spooked. Huh?
Yeah, they were very spooked. They were spooked about getting that bike claimed. It was the first real water cooled motocross bike in the world, and at least in America. And so, Bob's results were not nearly what they were before. And so, I think they were like, wait, now we've got a problem here. It's like that new bike is good and Bob's winning on it, but when we give him the old motor and the new chassis, it's not nearly as good. And it's like, shoot, we got to risk a championship here, or are we going to risk a bike being claimed? And so they went back to the water cooling, and here I am getting talked to a Yamaha. Hey, we're thinking about hiring Jan to be a kind of the second rider on our factory 125 program, and I'm thinking this is going to be cool. I'm going to sign and get a water cooled bike and the whole deal. And so when I did finally sign with Yamaha, and they made the decision to remove the water cooling off of the bikes and put air-cooled kits on the bikes that only raced in America. And that was pretty disappointing to me, and I never got a chance to ride that water-cooled 125 until 3 or 4 years later. So very disappointing. And
at that point, was it still just the head, or was it the cylinder also?
No, it was the cylinder head and the pump. It wasn't the heads back then. Were a couple of privateer companies had done that, and those were really based off of the thermosiphon, which hot air rises and cold air sinks, and that was more how they cooled. They didn't even have water pumps back then. Right. A couple of people tried to add some water pumps here and there, but the Yamaha was a full water cooled bike, and definitely. When the 77 bike went to Europe and the U.S. version of it, they had a place for the water pump, and that's another chapter in what happened to our bikes at the first national in 77 when the water pump bearing, that was left in the case, the engines heated up enough that the bearing fell out and it went into our shift forks and the shift mechanism underneath the clutch basket.
That makes for a rough moto.
It made for a rough moto for both Bob and myself at Hangtown. We got both. It would allow the bearing got wedged between the case and the shift mechanism, and so that it would allow for the bike to downshift. It would not allow for it to upshift. Oh, no. The bearing was sitting there. It was about the size of if you stacked about 4 or 5 dimes on top of each other. That's how small that little bearing was, but it worked its way down underneath the case. And sure enough, it made it to where we couldn't shift up. And so we both ended up in first gear and pulled into the pits with a DNF, and somebody had reported that it was a seizure or something, but I was a nobody then, truly. Like, they didn't even think I'd even be in the hunt by the end of the season, so nobody asked what happened to my bike. And at the time, we really didn't know, because I remember my mechanic, who was Jim Felt at the time. I remember he threw the bike on the side and started pulling the Kickstarter off, started to look at it, and you could you could pull a clutch cover off pretty easily. It didn't have the modern style, but you could get it off in 5 or so minutes. And he started yanking that thing apart, and I remember our team manager at the time, Kenny Clark, came by. What are you doing? What are you doing? You don't have time for that. We only have a support moto between your 2 races. You got to just put the spare motor in, So he kind of gave the orders for the mechanics, Keith McCarty and Jim Felt, to pull Bob's and pull my motors out and put the new backup, the spare motors, because we had 2 spare motors. And, they swapped them out. And the same darn thing happened to bikes the next moto too. exact same thing. And you have to keep in mind, you have to know that era a little bit. The bikes arrived really late, and we had a problem with them when we first tested them. And literally, they didn't get the new replacement parts to fix the problem with the initial engine until just a few weeks before the national. And Bob was busy doing supercrosses and outdoors and things, and I was really just, I was going to school. I was still in high school in my junior year, I guess, and we didn't test the bikes like they test today. I mean, our bikes, neither of those bikes when we arrived at Hangtown had ever had more than 10 or 15 minutes on an engine and never got hot enough to have the bearing fall out of the case. And so when that happened, it happened the next moto, and it's probably the smartest decision I made in my career. Maybe was literally once I went to shift it up and it wouldn't shift up, and I downshifted once down to third, and I went to shift back up, and I realized this thing's not shifting. I left it in third gear, and I rode the remaining 20-some minutes of that moto in one gear at Plymouth, the old sand track, and I literally passed a guy named Pat Richter on the motocross Fox bike when you were talking about the water-cooled bike. He had that water-cooled head on that bike. I passed him on the last lap for a second place in the moto, and that second place obviously helped me at the end of the year, or I would have never been in a position to even to get a championship. So.
Keep your foot as far away from the shifter as you could in that moto. Right?
Yeah, I remember going down the straightaways and just going, okay, you can't blow it up down the straightaway. You just got to, it's hard to not want to just hold it wide open. But I remember being smart enough to not do that. And then in the corners, you just tried to carry as much speed as you could to, it was a real sandy track and real rough, especially the second moto.
Factory bikes back in the day, were they a blessing or a curse? Because there was a lot of, revolutionary stuff going on at the time.
Yeah.
But, it was exotic stuff too.
Yeah. I look back at my career, and I mean, it's the bikes nowadays are so unbelievable. I mean, there's no question about it. I throw my leg over a YZ450 nowadays or whatever, and they're just like, these things are so good. It's ridiculous.
And bulletproof.
And they're just awesome motorcycles. No question about it. I mean, but on the little caveat to that is that I got to at least grow up. When I first started racing, like the very first bikes I had, like I remember literally my friend and I moving my shocks up on that Kawasaki 100 in metal shop at our we went to our junior high.
Okay.
Because they had a little auto shop in our junior high, and the teacher kind of knew how to weld. And so to be able to actually play with the bikes and do things like that, and to watch, the sport evolve so. I mean, you'd go to a Southern California race, and like every week you had to walk around the pits to see who was trying to invent a new suspension. There were bikes that had springs underneath the engine, in the cradle of the frame, and they had the shocks in the traditional kind of in a lay-down spot. There were people that were, the monoshock was around. There were people playing with different monoshock stuff. There were so many different things happening, how to figure out how to do long travel bikes, bikes that had jack shafts and double chains on them because the suspension was so long, like on the Makos, but the counter shaft was so far away from the pivot you couldn't keep a chain on the motorcycle, and the frames were flexing, but every week someone would come up with some really cool idea, and it was really a fun time to grow up. But there were definitely times that the factory bikes, and particularly if you look back at the history of the sport, you'll see where Yamaha off and on, before the production rule came into effect, before 84 season and 85 season, when Yamaha opted to race production bikes when the factory guys were still on the factory full factory machines, there was still times in Yamaha back in 78, 79 that guys like Hannah and myself, we would run production bikes, and they were at times a curse. And I remember particularly the season in 81, after Mike Bell had won the 80 championship in the Supercross, and our 81 bikes came over, and they were definitely a curse. I mean, they were really heavy. They tried to water cool the 250. The bikes were, literally 30 to 35 pounds heavier than the factory Suzukis, and the weight was all up high on and then the radiator would heat up the front forks, and they would cause pressure to build in the forks and things. So halfway through that season, if you look at pictures, we actually removed the water cooling off of the bikes, and also the travel had gotten so far that they started trying to run 340 millimeters of rear and 300 to 320 in the front fork, and the geometry and we didn't have this ability to control the dampening the same. And, really just you had a lot of travel, but it wasn't controlled travel. And it's not like it is today. If you need to add a little low speed or, mid or whatever you want to change to the bike as a click here and a click there, or maybe some shim changes. Back then you just had a lot of travel, and sometimes the movement was so dramatic between the front and the rear that the bike was hard to corner, and we found the limit. Trust me. In about 1981, we found the suspension travel limit.
Well, I remember watching Supercross back in the day, and it looked like outdoor suspension. It looked like it was a percentage stiffer, but it still looked pretty soft.
I never changed, and I actually, I very much enjoyed reading, an article. Davey Coombs and Racer X wrote the article about the last Trophy to Nations, because when I was on the team, we would run Motocross to Nations on 500cc bikes one week, and the next week we'd ride the Trophy to Nations on 250cc bikes, and they were 4-man teams, and we'd all ride 500s, and the next week we'd all ride in a different country, different location on 250cc bikes. And Davey mentioned the fact that I was able to substitute at the last Trophy to Nation ever in Sweden, and he said something about the bike was a borrowed bike, and he had that all right. It was a borrowed bike that I was racing. I raced a Supercross in Gothenburg, Sweden on Friday night, on a stock bike I borrowed from the Yamaha distributor, and he mentioned something, and then I came down Saturday and Sunday and raced the Saturday and Sunday events at the Trophy to Nations, and the American team comfortably won, and it was a really good deal. I got 2 seconds right behind Jeff Ward, and the American team had a great day and win the Trophy to Nations, but he mentioned something about having factory suspension on my bike, and I had to chuckle there, because Yamaha at 84 and 85, we didn't have factory suspension. We were the one team that didn't buy works components from KYB, and we had just Olean shocks on the rear that literally anybody could buy. And the front forks, we would put what was called a Simon's anti-cavitation kit in them, which, if you look back at some old funny advertisements, I remember there was one with Rick Johnson and myself acting like we were being shocked by this fork and this shock, and that's what we it in our bikes, and they weren't factory by any means. And so, there was, maybe we were at a disadvantage. I think we probably were back then, but it was fun times, and but there were times the factory stuff was, at Yamaha in particular, the production department and the factory department didn't work together very well, and sometimes they would go off on their own directions, and one way would work and one way wouldn't.
Gotcha. Well, you mentioned Jim Felt. You also had John R. as a mechanic. You had a couple of pretty interesting mechanics during your career.
Yeah, you talk about interesting, no question about it. I signed with Yamaha in 1976 in September. I was 16 years old. I was, and I don't know. Maybe it's genetics. I have a lot of energy. I enjoy talking to people, no question about it. You'll probably have to edit this thing down from a 7-hour interview to an hour. But it's, I signed with an Ed Scheidler, the old trusty Ed Scheidler, who some people remember him from the testing department there at Yamaha. But he was a mechanic for many years at Yamaha, and I thought, this is going to be great. And my parents thought, this is going to be great. You got the young kid, we're turning him loose as a 16-year-old kid. He's going to have this mature, stable father figure kind of a mechanic, and this is awesome. And so Pierre Karsmacher signs at the late, a few months after I sign, and he comes for the 1977 season at Yamaha. And his one stipulation in his contract was that I want Ed Scheidler as my mechanic, because he used to work with Ed, and he knew Ed, and he wanted Ed. And so I get this phone call. It's like, hey, I got something to tell you here, and it's, we're going to give you a new mechanic for next year. And I'm thinking, gosh, I've really gotten to bond with Ed pretty well. I mean, there was times during my little tryout period, I'd go stay at his house, and we'd go race races. I was like a father figure to me. And
settled in already.
Yeah, we're all settled in. I'm thinking, no, come on, who are you giving me? And they said this guy named Jim Felt, and I was like, gosh, dude, I don't know everybody in this sport, but I was on the Nationals last year, and Marty Smith has kind of taken me under his wing like his little brother. We used to go practicing together all the day, and I used to stand there and look at everything Honda had. And, I'd snuck some rides on those crazy fire-breathing Type 2 Honda factory. I knew all the mechanics at Honda, everybody knew me kind of like Marty's little buddy, and I knew some of the guys over at this team and that team. I didn't know who this Jim Felt guy was. And so they said, he used to work way back when. And I'm thinking, gosh, what am I getting myself into? Well, lo and behold, Jim was a fantastic mechanic, and I was lucky to have him. And we won multiple championships, and then he went on to win a couple of championships with Johnny O'Mara too. And I think he just had a issue with driving to Simi Valley to Cypress back and forth. Got a got into a little bit of a beef with Kenny Clark about that, and I think that's kind of what caused him to leave Yamaha, and it was just so disappointing for me at the time. It just came at a bad time, and it ended up costing me the 1980 Trans USA Championship when I was leading the points and going into the final day, and my swing arm pivot bolt fell off my bike, and the bike literally swing arm pivot bolt came out of the bike. Okay. Bike collapsed in two pieces, and I DNF'd and lost Yamaha the championship. And it was super disappointing for me, obviously. And it was like, I know that would have not happened had Jim Felt not been let go literally 2 weeks earlier. And we would have just been able to allow to finish out our series. And then if you wanted to fire the guy, fire him then. Don't fire him mid-series. And then... that was super, very disappointing. And then at that time, it just worked out for me. Marty Tripes went back to Honda, and John R. was Marty's mechanic. And he'd come over from Honda with Marty when Marty came to Yamaha for the 80 season. And then I was able to get John R. And if you don't know who John R. is, you could Google his name, and he's a brilliant mind. Truly, I'd have to say, and I've seen a lot of people come and go in our sport, and he's in pure raw intelligence. I don't know there's anybody any smarter that's ever spun a wrench on a dirt bike. That's for sure. He's a brilliant man.
Mm-hmm. Back in your era, you rode pretty much every class, but seemed to excel at the 125s and 500s. What was it about those two that suited you?
That's a good question. I think that's actually that's a misleading statistic, and I'm not trying to say what I kind of rode all of them. I think I've certainly excelled more outdoors than indoors. Jim Felt, we would refer to Supercross as stupid cross. Neither of us were a big fan of it. I was a purist. When I grew up, I was trying to emulate. When I saw a picture of Marty Smith going through a berm, in absolute picture-perfect form, shoulder square to the bars, laid over, on that Works Honda, dragging his handlebar through a corner, or the famous Bel-Ray ad of Roger DeCoster dragging the handlebar at the Carlsbad USGP on his Suzuki. That's what I would go out and try to do. I'd go out and try to, hey, can I go through a corner and drag my handlebar? I wasn't trying to do a triple jump, double jump, trying to do some Supercross. That wasn't what was in my mind. My mind was, motocross. I was a big fan of motocross. I didn't, Supercross was kind of just coming along then and getting bigger and bigger. Of course, if I had, forward thinking, I would have realized how much more important Supercross was. But that's probably why. And I only really raced the outdoor championship in the one time in the 250 and came one DNF away from winning that thing, and also literally a missed shift. The 1982 championship at Castle Rock, it came down to myself, Rick Johnson, and Donnie Hansen, and we all had trouble one race or another during the race. I'd sanded a motor at Southwick, and I DNF'd and ended up with, 11th overall or something, but I blew up a motor in one moto and made a DNF. So that cost me a good chance for the championship. But when we came into the last race, first moto, Rick jumped a little too far, blew out a front wheel, so that made his championship, what looked like he had a great chance of winning it. It disappeared with that DNF. And so we all had Donnie Hansen, myself, and Rick had all had like one problem. So it went down to the final race, and I came through the pack and actually had passed Donnie Hansen on the last lap, and I came through the final corner. It was a real ruddy corner, but I hugged the inside, went through the corner, and then my bike had just kind of bounced in some acceleration bumps, and it landed on the shifter, the frame. My foot was nowhere near it, but it popped in neutral, and Donnie was right behind me, but he had enough, foresight, I guess, to jump out of the berm, and we raced to the finish line, and before I could jam it back into gear, and we were literally, I don't think it was a photo finish. And had I beat Donnie, and Donnie ended up winning that moto, and then I came back and won the second moto and the overall. But the problem was when we all got done, if you look at the points, it was 300, 297, 294. But if you would have given my 294 3 points, I'd be 297. You take 3 points away from 300, you get 297. And Donnie Hansen, Rick Johnson, and myself would have all three had 297. So that's how close that championship was to the 250 to winning the Triple Crown for me. And I only raced the 250 championship 1 year, and that was at 82. And to this day, I'm still not sure why Yamaha took me from a 81 number one plate and put me in the 250 class. I'm still thinking back, like, well, why did I agree to that? I'm not sure. And then in the championship that people, to me, is kind of like my seventh major EMA championship, the Trans USA in 1981. I mentioned earlier the 1980 championship, Trans USA, where we were all racing 250 bikes outdoors in all the same class: the Howertons, the Hannas, the Barnetts, the Wards, the O'Mearas.
All the megastars.
All the megastar of the era. We're all racing the same race series. It's a 5-race series. And we were all racing them on the grand tracks. There was Unadilla, Mid-Ohio, Hangtown was in there. I'm trying to think which other ones that we did. Red Bud. And, these were all the grand tracks, the good ones that we all like to race on. They were all in that series. And I had the championship pretty much, won until my swing arm pivot bolt. Well, come back the next year, 81. And there's 5 more races, and I win 4 of the 5. And the one race I didn't win was the Red Bud, and I went DNF 1. So, do I feel like I could have run one Red Bud? Had again, I actually seized a bike there, which was rare for us. Mm-hmm. And, had I not DNF'd that moto, yes, I do believe I would have won all 5 outdoor championships on 250 bikes against all the megastars of the era. That, to me, was a kind of a, it was hard in my mind at that point. I kind of thought it made a little bit of a statement at that time, who was the best outdoor guy. And I felt like I would certainly have to be in the discussion of the argument when you win 4 out of 5 and you win the one you go DNF 1 and the other one you don't win. Mm-hmm. So, to say I wasn't that good on a 250, I don't know, and I think I did ride them all about equally, actually. But I certainly I was no fan of Supercross, to be honest with you. I mean, I was capable at it, but I didn't like it.
How beastly were those big 500s?
You Google my name, and most of the time the word YZ490 comes up in the top 2 or 3 searches. And I certainly, the people talk about the Air Hammer and all these things, but the beastie bikes that I rode were the 81 and then again in 83, because as I mentioned earlier, I didn't ride it in 82. It was pretty much the same motor. They were the air-cooled single cylinder. They had the power valve on them. They were the OW bike. And that bike was a crazy overbore configuration. I remember Mike Bell and I, we get a call up, hey, you're going to go test your works bikes. Now, this isn't back in December. This is literally just a month before the first race at Southwick. And we go up there, and or it was a little bit before that, because they still had kind of a choice of which engine configuration to use. So we went up there and tested 2 engine configuration. One was a very long stroke motor, and the thing was very, very smooth. And when I mean very, very smooth, it was the most non-exciting, least. Oh my God, docile isn't even. You can't even describe. This thing was accelerated. It took like an calendar to figure out when it was going to build its top RPM. You could have never gotten a whole shot with this bike, and it was terribly, really nice. I mean, linear power wasn't the case. And then you had this other one. You'll try this other configuration. This thing was like a light switch, and it was just absolute beast to ride. It accelerated really, really hard, and it just was quick power build. Well, the one was a real long stroke, small bore. One was a real short stroke, like 7592, I think was the configuration. It was a 498, and it had a 92 millimeter piston. Well, that big of a piston, factory Kawasaki had an 88 piston, and they put 2 spark plugs and 2 coils in their bike, thinking that an 88 piston could not be managed by one. Was too big to have a single spark plug to cover that whole flame pattern. And so bottom line was, that was the bike with the power valve, and the power valve lowered and the exhaust port lowered, and then the thing pinged like crazy coming into the corner, and you really surged and lurched, and you really couldn't control it. And we ended up having to disconnect the power valve to make it more manageable, mostly on deceleration coming in the corner, and help reduce the pinging, because you could not carburate that bike. It would always ping somewhere in the moto. And so those were the beastie bikes. That bike was faster than all heck, and it was a handful to ride, but I mean, it's still one of my favorite motorcycles I ever raced, because man, it was exciting as heck, and it was fun. I liked it.
Get the adrenaline kick during the motos.
Yeah, and the 490 was a great bike, but it just, at the time I was racing against the factory Kawasaki's, the factory Suzuki's, and of course that HRC bike that David had, that water-cooled bike and all that stuff. So to try to run the 490s against that, I mean, there was no question I was in a battle with a pea shooter there. So.
Well, I remember sales kind of tapered and the 500 class went away, partly, people, it kind of got too big and hard for people to ride. Mm-hmm. We seem to have replaced them with kind of the same thing over again.
Yeah, it was, no question about it. They were a beast, and very few people could ride them very, very well. And Yamaha also opted, like you said, sales had started diminishing. There was the recession there that really hurt, and Yamaha at that point, it's like it doesn't even add up to ride these expensive factory bikes like this. And so in 1984, Yamaha opted to go production. And so in 84 and 85, it was kind of announced in about the 84, 85 era that the AMA did kind of give a forewarning to the other factories that, hey, we're going production-based rule. And, but we did it 2 years early, and it was no question. And you look back at it, hey, there were, was I offered other rides for other companies? No question about it. And to me, to this day, it's like, you can't change what happened in the past. And you do always wrestle with, what if I would have done this? What if I would have done that? No question about it. 2 different times I had Honda contracts signed by the people at Honda. All I had to do was put my name on them, and I would have been on Honda. 2 times, not once, twice, and they're multi-year contracts. And I opted to be loyal, and I opted to stay with Yamaha, and I still, to this day, have a great relation with the guys at Yamaha. I do look back at my career, and I say, it's pretty cool that I stayed primarily, 13 plus years with one company. That's pretty cool.
That's rare.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. And I do like that. But, would I have won some more races in a factory riding an HRC, Honda RC bike? I think so. A 500 particularly. And I look back and I see, all my teammates. It was Yamaha. It was a revolving door, but it was a one-way exit door. I mean, you started with the Bob Hanna leaving. He was like, "No, I'm done. I'm going over. I rode their bikes over there. I know how good they are." Then you go with the Rick Johnson. Then you go with the Jeff Stantons, and it was like literally they were going that way. Anybody that came our way, it kind of, Mickey Diamond, guys like that, it kind of hurt their career. It seemed like. Mm-hmm. So but the tide shifts both ways, Yamaha bikes are great now, and there's always, everybody has their day in the sun. Prior to that, Suzuki was kind of having their day in the sun. But looking back and all, of course I would have liked to have had a chance to ride some of those bikes, but I also am pretty proud of what I did for Yamaha too, and hopefully they enjoy looking back at what I did also.
Compare the Supercross tracks the guys are on now to what you guys were riding back in the day.
When they built obstacles in our day, they weren't quite sure what the riders were going to do. They really weren't, and people didn't have practice tracks. Honda Land came about, and we found, hey, God, these guys at Honda built their own Supercross track somewhere, so they're riding on these Supercross tracks every day. And so at one point, Rick Johnson and I got a hold of some friends that we knew in San Diego, and we built our own Supercross track because we got left behind. All the other teams were building Supercross tracks and things like that. And getting practice on it and understanding it. So then Yamaha built one too later on, but it was like at that point, it wasn't like today. These guys now, they just walk up to a jump and go, oh, that thing's, 92 feet or, 74-foot triple. They just know, they jump it on the first lap because they know exactly what it feels like because they practice on it all week and they get the dimensions of the track. There were many times during our era where they would build these massive jumps thinking they were going to be a single or a double, and someone would do something completely absurd. And all of a sudden, me as a rider, I would sit back and go, like, your first words were, oh crap, now I have to do it. Insert the name of the local, era crazier rider of the time. And then you're, wow, okay, now do I do it now, or do I wait till AMA makes a decision like, hey, this thing's way too dangerous, we're going to cut it down? And that happened probably 75% of the time, but once in a while it didn't happen, and you had to go for it. And it was crazy. I still look back. A friend of mine, there was a picture that I see once in a while pop up on Facebook from the LA Coliseum during a practice session, and I'm looking up going, and it's taken from the stands, and I'm way up there in the air. And I look back and I'm like, man, what was I thinking? That looks dangerous, especially on a 1985 bike.
Right.
And
one of the ones that used to throw me was Coca-Cola Catapult, a big launcher to flat. Yeah. And there was an award at the end of the night for whoever jumped the furthest.
Yeah, exactly. Well, getting back to kind of, modern track designs versus old, I personally, I mean, I've been going to motocross races 50 years. I mean, there's not a lot of people who've been going 50 years. And so looking back and seeing how the Supercross has evolved from the early days, even watching as a kid, as a spectator, and then seeing where they are and riding them all through that era now, there's no question we have to make the tracks a little more safe. I mean, we're hurting too many people. Injuries are not good for anybody. It's not good. People think, oh, they don't care. Yes, they do care, because when you got your stars injured, they don't put seats,
butts in the seats.
Yeah, butts in the seats. There's not people sitting in the stands, and so because of that, it does hurt their pocketbook. It hurts their attendance, and it doesn't look good on TV when you do a scan and there's half the stadium empty. Mm-hmm. So they do care, and and they're making things changes. And if you remember the last year, the last race in 2018 at Las Vegas, there was actually a point there where I actually sent a text message up to one of the Feld people, and I said, hey, congratulations, you guys did a fantastic job. You always hear the complaints, I'm sure, but this is fantastic that you guys didn't lose the track. And when I mean lose the track, to me, when you lose a track is when the track gets to a certain point where if you put water on it, it becomes unrideable.
Worse instead of better.
Yeah, so they made it a great track. There was a loamy berm developing on the starting line straight of Las Vegas during May. I mean, that's pretty rare. Usually it's blue groove concrete. And the fact I thought was so terrific about that racetrack, if you go back and look at any footage of it, from the time they went over to the finish line jump, the next right-hander was just a flat corner leading onto the start straight, another flat first turn corner leading into a single or sand pit, a big jump. They didn't have another Supercross obstacle, truly, other than a big single. There was no doubles, there was no tables, no rhythm sections, nothing, until they got all the way back into the stadium, and they went into a slower right-hander, and then into a pretty tough set of whoops where you could take any line. And so really, it was exciting. The track was fast. The racing was pretty darn good, and they weren't killing anybody. So it's like, hey, you can race at this level on these bikes with this skill level of the modern rider, which is unbelievable. Mm-hmm. At that level, you can make a pretty safe track and still make it exciting for the fans, and they did it.
What was it like to be part of the whole let Broc buy deal? I mean, we've seen some team racing in the couple recent years. So,
I mean, honestly, if I told you it was anything other than just kind of a bitter pill, I mean, of course, it's so. Here's the funny kind of this, we talked about it earlier about the bearings and the engine. That series that year was only, I believe, 6 races long total. So you had 12 motos. Both myself and my teammate at the time, Bob Hanna, both had mechanical complete failures. I mean, like I said, I survived, by just leaving the bike in third gear. Bob got stuck down in the lower gear. He finally, instead of pulling in, knowing that nothing was going to break, he managed, I think, like a 17th or 18th. He managed 3 or 4 points. I managed, like I said, a last lap pass gave me 22. But that series, I was absolutely a 16-year-old kid when I started that series. I was definitely no way in heck going to be anywhere near the contention who's going to win the championship. And that's why even at Hangtown, not a single journalist even talked to me. They didn't ask, hey, what happened to your bike? Right. I would have known, because by an hour after the race, Jim Felt finally continued pulling that engine apart. And I remember to this day, I was sitting in a lawn chair right there in the pits, and I saw he pulled it off, and he's just like, the look on his face. Look, he pulls this bearing out of the side of the clutch, and he realized, what had caused all this havoc, and obviously what had happened to the second moto, all 4 of our engines. So that being said, and the fact that the race was Hangtown, which Plymouth was back then was a total sand track. The next race was a place called Keysburg, Illinois. To this day, I think myself, and I'm sure I've seen it in print, where Bob Hanna claimed it was the roughest motocross track he'd ever raced in his life. And it was a total sand track. And then again, the next one was in Midland, Michigan, which was a complete sand track up in the middle of Michigan in the forest. So on paper, I was kind of screwed. I mean, I had 3 sand tracks. I grew up in San Diego in Southern California.
There's no Sandy in San Diego, right?
No, there is no Sandy in San Diego. Good call on that. And so the fact that if you look back at it in my era, no question about it, but even in the history of the sport, and go, if I told you, asked me, tell me, the top give me a Mount Rushmore of good sand riders of you American motocross riders. Of course, you'd have to pick one of the guys that came out of Southwick maybe, but you'd have to put Hanna and you'd have to put Laporte. I mean, Danny grew up riding in Yucca Valley. He was strong. He was a great sand rider. He was on the first team that won the Motocross of Nations in Lommel. Okay? I mean, he knows how to ride the sand. And Bob, no different. I mean, Bob spent years in Florida series, and he was a fantastic sand rider too. I had no chance on paper, no chance. And really, Yamaha there was zero pressure on me going into that series. And so after the first couple of rounds, Bob had started, Danny went 1-1, had 50 points. I had 22, and Bob had 4 or something. So the first race or two, Bob had good races at Keithsburg. I think he went 1-1 there. And when it all got said and done, and then we get to the next race is Midland, another sand track, and then now we're in the heat of the summer in the sand, and I'm a skinny little 16-year-old kid. I'm like, this sucks. What did I sign up for? And this is tough. This is tough. And somehow I came through in the second moto and won the second moto. But by the 5th moto of that year, granted, like I said, this is a 12 moto series. It's not like it's 12 rounds. It's 12 motos, 6 races. Not
24 motos.
No, it's not 24 motos. And by the 5th moto, Hannah has already passed me in the point standings. I'm like in 5th or 6th place or something. I'm not even in the hunt. And so I come back and win the second moto at Midland, and that's my first moto win for Yamaha, and it's only my second moto win. I won one the year before with DG on a Honda Elsinore. And so, it's like, okay, that felt pretty good to win a moto. And then we go to my favorite track in the world at Rio Bravo, and I won by comfortably, easily both motos. So now all of a sudden I got 3 in a row coming, and I'm like, hey, that's pretty good. And now I'm back ahead of Bob, but I'm still behind Danny. And now I've worked my way, I think, in second place in the championship. And I didn't even know all of this until about a year and a half ago. I looked it up finally, and I literally made an Excel spreadsheet because I was trying to help document the first 2 or 3 of the 120 years of the 125 Nationals, and even before I turned pro, because there's really, really vague history of that. In even like the vault or any of that stuff it's not even accurate because you can't find out the information. And so then I realized, like, shoot, Bob was already past me by the 5th moto of the year. It's not like it's not like Bob, it's not like I got lucky at the last race or something and all of a sudden got ahead of him. No, he had already passed me, but then I reversed it past him. And by winning 3 straight motos going into a St. Joe, Missouri, and Bob did, I remember that race really well. I had 2 very poor, uncharacteristic poor starts. I mean, I used to get good starts, and I got 2 really poor starts, and I had to work really hard to get a third and a second in that moto. And Bob got 2 good starts, which was a little uncharacteristic, and he won both motos. So now he's real close to me in the point standings, and we go to the last and final race. And that was one of those things where we get to San Antonio. Yamaha's trying to think anything and everything they can do to, on mathematically, this is kind of what needs to happen. If we were to have Broc go 1-1, if Broc was able to go 1-1 is a better way to put it. Bob was 2-2 and Danny was 3-3. We could win the championship because, Danny had only won the 2 motos that Bob and I had mechanical failures. He hadn't won a moto at all season long, other than the first 2 motos at Hangtown. So it looked pretty good. And the bikes back then were not really that reliable. I mean, having a seizure wasn't uncommon, or having a flat tire certainly was even more likely. So Yamaha opted to go, if we can bring some extra riders in here, we probably won't, they're not going to win. They're not going to, this isn't dirty pool thing. Those guys were just hoping a Mike Bell or a Burgett or one of these guys, even Pierre at the time, they entered Pierre thinking if Danny has a flat or he has a seizure and he's limping around trying to get done to the finish line, if we can put a guy or 2 between him as he struggles to the finish line, we could we could take points away from him and give us a better chance. So I remember us having a meeting, and they said, okay, we're calling a meeting, a little team meeting the night before, and discuss what we're going to do. And so we ended up going to a hotel room, and I was thinking we're going to have like this strategy meeting. This thing lasted about a minute. Okay, guys, we're all here. We all know we got a championship we could possibly win here tomorrow. So just go out and race real hard the first moto, and we'll see what happens after the first moto.
So gloves are off for the first moto.
it was nothing more than just go see what happens. I mean, in motor, you know how it is, Steve. You've seen it a million times. You know, you go to a Supercross championship. Did you ever think for a million years that Eli Tomac at East Rutherford would ride around and finish 7th or 8th? I mean, honestly, it was an out of body. It wasn't even the guy you saw all season long. It can happen. Anything can happen.
Right.
A guy can have a good day, a bad day, a bike. And like I said, back then, what we were kind of thinking more than anything is like, you know, bikes aren't that reliable. And you're racing in 100-degree plus weather, 105 degrees in San Antonio in August. It's miserable.
Good times.
And man, let me tell you, there's a good chance somebody's bike's probably going to break. So what do? We go and gate drops. I win. Okay? That's a mano a mano. Mm-hmm. And now you look back at, okay, let's go back and look at the previous 6 motos going into the final Let Broc Buy moto. The previous 6 motos, I got 4 moto wins and a 2nd and a 3rd. Okay? And at that point, you know, Bob has some moto wins in there. He has a 2 at St. Joe, Missouri. But he also has a 4th or 5th at Rio Bravo. It wasn't one of his favorite tracks. And you look at his results versus mine of those previous 6 motos, and it's not even close. Like I said, I have 4 wins, a 2nd and a 3rd. And at that point, I got a gap on him to where he really doesn't have much of a mathematical chance unless something happens again to Danny's bike and something happens to my bike. So we go into the final moto.
Your best bet is you.
Yamaha's best bet right then is absolutely me. And then what happens is they let the gate drops. Bob gets the whole shot. You know, did I choke and not get a start? I don't know. I'm sure I was nervous as all heck, no question about it. Yeah, so by the time I worked my way through the field, and I actually went and paid my archive $290 or whatever it was, $599 a year. I actually read the article of Cycle News at that point, and they even mentioned that I was gaining 2 to 3 seconds a lap, but ran out of time. You know, and you know, what was Yamaha to do? I think had I been in the situation Bob was in, I would have probably just known I wouldn't need a signboard. I don't know. Yamaha opted to wait till the last final lap based off of, hey, so anything can happen anytime. They didn't know who knows? Bob could have got a flat tire. Mm-hmm. Danny could have. They don't know. If Danny would have got a flat tire and finished 6th, they would have never needed to be a board. But the board came out. Clearly, 2 photographers took the photo of it. The rest is kind of history sort of a thing. And, yeah, you know, Bob definitely helped me and Yamaha win a championship. No question about it. You know, I look back at it as I was never even expected to be remotely in that position to even be there. Mm-hmm. And it's like, and what my dad continually points out to me, he's like, don't you remember that happening? Billy Grossi used to pull over for Danny Laporte all the time in the 76 championship. And I finally did ask Danny, and Danny's never had a hard feeling one to me. And Danny and I have been friends. We were friends before that thing, and we've been friends afterwards. And I just talked to him literally 2 days ago on his birthday, and he and I have gone skiing together. We've gone to Europe together. We've done so many things together, and none of us have ever even really – it's never been a bone of contention for us. Danny also – I did finally ask Danny, hey, what was the deal in 76? Why I was I was just tongue in the spoke trying to get to the finish line. But my dad used to tell me that, Billy pulled over for Danny or whatever, and my dad would remind me of that. And it's like, dude, it's not the first time this has ever happened in the sport. It happened last year a bunch of times. And I asked Danny, and he said, hey, listen, I was racing Marty Smith for 2nd place. I know Bob was winning the championship, but Suzuki wanted 2nd in the point standings. And as it ended up, Danny goes, I don't even remember. I think I tied him or we were close, and I looked it up, and Marty beat him by a point or 2. But it was for 2nd in the championship, and that meant something. And even Danny got a bonus for 2nd and 3rd in the championship. So it had happened so many times. Yes, was this a more high-profile thing? Was it written as it was this crazy, devious thing like the Russians were going to, like the Russian Mosov days where somebody was going to knock – nobody was going to knock anybody down. They were there basically. If Danny had a mechanical to take advantage and try to get between him and the next point earner, and that was all that was. And, Mike Bell, for God's sake, got 4th place overall. He's not Mike Bell was a very good rider, and he could ride a one. But Mike was a many-time CMC champion on a Honda 125 Elsinore, even as tall as he was. He was a good rider, and he was a good rider in Supercross, and he was a good rider in motocross. And at that time, he was still a good rider. And so he could have done a lot, and there was no question, do you want to win things based off of a team? No. But did Yamaha want Suzuki to win the championship? Absolutely not. And so, here you are and we are talking about it, and you think back, when was 1977? I mean, how long ago was 1977? Yet it's still one of these stories. And for me, is it a bitter pill? Yeah, of course, because I really honestly don't feel like I did something wrong.
Yeah, I'm not accusing
you. No, but
that's
what I'm saying. I don't feel like I worked my butt off. I was proud to become a factory rider at 16 years old. I was winning. I was the youngest national champion for decades and I never really even truly should have been in the situation on paper. And I was proud that by the end of the season, I believe I was the fastest guy. And I really do. I believe I was the fastest guy. And, it was I'm here 30, 40 years later, I'm still listening to it.
Explaining it.
Yeah, I'm still explaining it.
But it's interesting in the last couple of years, we've seen some team style stuff.
Yeah.
Marvin and Dunge at East Rutherford.
Absolutely.
Maybe the Monster Cup this most recent time, too.
Yeah. And the Monster Cup was kind of interesting. And, of course, it got, back up again, things. But, hey, my take on the Monster Cup was a little different. I'm sorry. Joey rode a tremendous race. I don't think he would have kept Eli behind him. Sorry.
Yeah,
Final corner for $1 million. And Eli had figured out those two sandpits runs. He was gaining a ton of time on both of them on each side of the stadium. And I do not think – and the corner before that, Eli was remarkable. Feet on the pegs in a gnarly – I walked back there to look at that rut because I was watching him go through that corner, feet on the pegs, as fast as anyone all night long. I'm like, how is he doing this? Feet on the pegs. He's not even got his foot out. And I looked at it, and it was even more difficult than I thought watching. And then I know how fast he was coming down that straightaway. And you nobody in the stands, nobody in the world would have blamed him for if he would have had to do a little bit of a aggressive move in the final corner for $1 million. So, yeah, did it happen again? Yeah, it did. But it wasn't for a championship. It was, and the money didn't come out of anyone in the stands' pocket.
Right. Well, I also don't think you want to do your first race on a new team and cost your teammate $1 million. It's not a way to, ease your way into the system there.
It's not a way. And the other thing, you look back at it, you kind of, I can see your point there. No question about it. It's a good point. But I look back at it and say, it's a team tactic, no question about it. Okay, would Joey have done that had he not been on a Kawasaki Monster Energy teammate? Of course he would have not. But on the other side of the coin, when you're out testing and somebody's in Florida testing something and somebody's in California testing something, and you find out, wow, this thing is really good, this part's really good, this setting's really good, this engine program really good, whatever it is, do you share it? Of course you do. Do your engineers go, hey, Eli just tested this thing and he says it's awesome. Joey, give it a try. Is that teammate helping another teammate? It is. Yeah. You're a team for a reason. They're trying to, and the funny part, watching the American Formula One and car racing, and the teammates do the same thing. It's like, oh, here comes this guy. He's on fresh tires, and he just gets out of the way and lets his guy go by. Yeah, the Ferrari's not going to block the other Ferrari. That's just. You spend all that time and effort making your brand up front, your sponsors win, you're going to get most bang out of your buck out of a multi-rider, multi-team driver car or team. So. Yeah,
but it's interesting in F1, you really do have team orders, and there is a primary guy and a kind of a secondary guy, and it's known even in the team what the tier is.
Scott Wallenberg brought this up to me one time when we were sitting around talking. He goes, hey, I'm still trying to find this article because I read it, but in the world, what was before the World 125 Championship, Andrea Malherbe was riding for Zundap, and they had a little team deal on the last race to make sure that Andre was going to win the 125 what was considered the European Championship for the 125s. And Scott Wallenberg said, I read this article, and it was the journalist reported that the team tactics worked flawlessly and blah, 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 and this and that, because one guy did this and he pulled over for the other guy, and then he kind of rode aggressively enough to kind of block the next guy enough to where it slowed him down so that Andre could break open a lead. And it was like the perfect team tactics, and it worked exactly as planned and how it should have and how it was drawn up. And it was so different than, it's right. Like, oh, the world is coming to an end because, somebody somebody threw a moto or let his teammate by on the last lap. And you know, I mean, of course, you know, I have a biased view. I'm the guy that benefited to a point, but honestly, I don't know that I've even, looking back at it, yeah, I guess I benefited. I felt like I backed it up somewhat, and my career be any different if they just took that title away? I don't know. You know, it's hard to say. I lost 2 or 3 other titles by 1 point or the last point or here and there too. So
or something on the team like that swing arm bolt cost.
Yeah. I've lost that one. There was like I said, there's so many different ones, but it's racing, man. You just race the best you can. You do your best you can, and at that time, particularly, like I said, I think I was a month or two into my 17th year in my life, and I was just I thought I'd signed with Yamaha to ride a cool water-cooled bike and be Bob Hanna's teammate, not to be a part of a controversial championship. I was just trying to ride my motorcycle.
Yep. Hey, it's Guyby again. Want the bad news? This episode's over. The good news? We had so much more to talk about, we decided to make this one a 2-parter. That's it for part 1 of the 12th episode of The Inside Line, presented by Thor. We hope you enjoyed the conversation with Broc. Remember, for over 50 years, Thor MX has been at the forefront of motocross racewear innovation with products that are purpose-built to help riders perform at the highest level in one of the most demanding sports in the world. The 2019 collection, featuring the revolutionary Prime Pro racewear, is available now. Head to thormx.com to learn more. We also have to thank Chaparral Motorsports. For more than 30 years, Chaparral Motorsports has been sharing its love of dirt bikes with like-minded individuals by offering a massive selection of the latest riding gear, new models, parts and accessories, and great pricing on tires. Visit chapmoto.com. That's chapmoto.com. If you're like us, you love your bench racing, look for the next Inside Line soon. In the meantime, you can subscribe to the show via your favorite podcast platform so that you don't miss any future episodes. You can also go back and check out previous shows. If you're feeling really generous, leaving us a rating and review always helps. Thanks.